New data out today shows the country's debt has continued to rise in the second quarter of this year to €3,416 billion, increasing by nearly €71 billion just in the past 3 months.
For the first time in decades, France is drowning in debt. The number is staggering: $4 trillion. That's more than the country produces in an entire year, over 100% of its GDP. Within the European Union, only Greece and Italy are weighed down by heavier burdens. But here's where it gets interesting. The combined debt of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, 3 African nations that France has recently clashed with, doesn't even amount to a quarter of what Paris owes. The irony is striking. And now, the streets of France are on fire. Protests, clashes, a restless population boiling with anger. It feels like the nation is sliding into its greatest crisis since the French Revolution. The timing makes it even more dramatic. Just as debt levels explode, the French government itself has collapsed. The old order looks fragile, exposed, and weak. This is no longer just an economic crisis. It's something deeper, something existential. The most pressing question now is clear. Is France becoming ungovernable under Emmanuel Macron? We'll uncover the answer in today's video. On September 8, 2025, the world turned its eyes to Paris. Inside the French National Assembly, lawmakers gathered for yet another dramatic moment. And we say yet again because this wasn't the first time. It was the third time in just 2 years that they faced this exact decision. The question was simple, yet explosive. Should Prime Minister François Bayrou remain in power or be cast aside? The tension inside the chamber was unbearable. Every vote counted felt like a hammer striking down on the future of France. And when the final numbers came in, the verdict was devastating. 364 lawmakers voted no confidence. Only 194 stood with the prime minister. It was a landslide. Bayrou was finished. This made him the third prime minister to be ousted in barely 2 years. He had taken over less than a year earlier, stepping in after Michel Barnier's fragile administration collapsed in December 2022. For President Emmanuel Macron, Bayrou was supposed to be the steady hand that would guide France back to stability, a calm leader for turbulent times. But instead, he became infamous for pushing brutal austerity plans, over $44 billion in cuts that angered millions across the nation. And just like that, another government fell. On paper, his plan seemed like what any government would do in the current economic climate. Actually, the plan is similar to what the IMF would propose to any developing country. It basically revolves around cutting down government spending, increasing taxes, and reducing the country's debt. But just like how such proposals never work out in developing countries, the implementation of the austerity plan hit France, and especially the French people, hard. Bayrou Future proposed the abolishment of 2 national holidays and cutting down pensions at a time where ordinary citizens were already feeling the effects of high cost of living. For the average French citizen, cutting down pensions in order to increase the national budget was just too much. But that wasn't the tip of the iceberg. Under the French Constitution, Article 49, subsection 3 allows the Prime Minister to bypass Parliament and push a law through by tying it to a confidence vote. In politics, such a gamble seems pretty simple because it's either lawmakers let the bill pass or they vote down the entire government. In his mind, he thought that the members of parliament would not risk political chaos by choosing to vote down the entire government. But what Bayrou never expected was that the lawmakers, at least most of them, were united together against him for personal reasons. The attack on Bayrou came from every side. Left-wing deputies accused him of trampling on democracy. Right-wing lawmakers saw an opportunity to strike at Macron's fragile government. By the evening of September 8th, the verdict was inescapable. François Bayrou walked into the Élysée Palace and handed in his resignation. President Macron had no choice but to accept it. And just like that, the French government collapsed. But the chaos didn't last long. Less than 24 hours later, on September 9th, Macron announced a replacement. His choice was bold and personal. He turned to one of his closest allies, Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu. At only 39 years old, Lecornu's rise is extraordinary. Known for his discipline, pragmatism, and above all, loyalty to Macron, he now stands among the youngest leaders in modern French history. To Macron's centrist loyalists, his appointment was a victory, a signal of stability in the storm. But for the opposition, it was another reason to fight. They see Le Cornu not as a savior, but as a shield, another layer protecting a president they believe is running out of time. The backlash was immediate. Marine Le Pen, leader of the far-right National Party, didn't mince words. The president is firing the last shot of Macronism, holed up in his bunker with a small group of loyalists. On the far left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon of France Unbowed was just as ruthless. Only Macron's departure can put an end to this sad comedy, a comedy of contempt for parliament, voters, and political decency. The message from France's political class was clear. The elites were united in their anger. But the discontent didn't end there. Reports showed that fewer than 30% of French citizens believed Sébastien Lecornu could solve the crisis. To most, his appointment was meaningless, another face at the top while their daily struggles went unanswered. And so, the people responded the only way they knew how. Just one day after Lecornu took office, on September 10th, tens of thousands of French citizens flooded the streets. Their chants were not about who sat in power, but about the lives they were struggling to live. They didn't care about titles, alliances, or Macron's political maneuvers. What they wanted was simple, a government that worked for them. And in that moment, the anger of the streets became louder than the voice of the Élysée. In Paris, the beating heart of the protest was the Place de la République. There, thousands of citizens gathered, their voices rising in unison, their message unmistakable. According to the Washington Post, France's new prime minister was greeted not with applause, but with an army of 175,000 block-everything protesters. And they meant it. Roads were barricaded, train stations were shut down, fires lit the night sky as demonstrators unleashed their fury against budget cuts. By the end of the first day, nearly 500 arrests had been made, but the spirit of defiance only grew stronger. So, why exactly were they protesting? The spark may have been Bayrou's austerity plan, but the fire had been smoldering for years. Ordinary families were already being crushed under a cost of living crisis. Then came the shock. The price of electricity soared to over 1,100 euros per megawatt hour, 10 times higher than what people paid just a year earlier in 2024. Some of this could be explained by the aftershocks of the war in Ukraine, but the deeper wound was far more painful and far more political. Orano, France's uranium giant, once relied on Niger to fuel the very reactors that power 1/5 of France's electricity. That lifeline was cut when Niger's new military government tore up Orano's license and kicked the French company out. And in that single move, the energy security of France and the comfort of its citizens was thrown into chaos. In Niger, Orano once had access to some of the world's cheapest uranium, but when its license was revoked, everything changed. Now, France must scramble for alternatives, and those alternatives don't come cheap. The fallout is clear. Ordinary French citizens are paying the price. Electricity costs skyrocketed, but it didn't stop there. The pain rippled across every sector of the economy. Families already struggling with high food prices, rent, and fuel were suddenly told they had to sacrifice even more, spend less, pay more, accept cuts to pensions. That was the heart of the protests, and the demonstrations weren't just loud, they were symbolic. In Paris, sanitation workers joined the strike, leaving trash piled high on the sidewalks. These weren't just protests, they were warnings, a glimpse of how daily life in France could collapse if people were pushed too far. Which raises the question, how did it come to this? How did France, the 7th largest economy in the world, end up facing a crisis that feels more like the struggles of a developing nation than the power of a European giant? A closer look at France's debt reveals a grim reality. Today, the country's total debt stands at $4 trillion, more than 100% of its GDP. Put simply, France is now one of the heaviest borrowers in Western Europe. For every 100 euros the economy produces, the government already owes more than 100 euros. But how did it get here? The answer isn't one single policy, it's the legacy of decades. Successive French governments borrowed from global financial institutions to fund wars, build social programs, expand infrastructure, and cushion the blow of economic downturns. Each crisis added another layer to the mountain of debt. But the real explosion came in the last 5 years, in the aftermath of COVID. Like many nations, France borrowed massively to keep jobs alive and businesses afloat. Emergency aid packages, subsidies for furloughed workers, and financial lifelines meant to save the economy ended up costing billions. The result? A debt crisis spiraling to astronomical heights, and a nation now forced to pay the price. Then came the energy crisis. It began in 2022 after the Russia-Ukraine war erupted. Like much of Europe, France depended heavily on Russian gas. But when sanctions cut off access, the era of cheap oil and gas was over. The impact was brutal. To shield households from crushing energy bills, the French government introduced what it called the tariff shield. In 2023 alone, it cost the state more than 45 billion euros, money that France did not have. By 2024, alarm bells were ringing in Brussels. The European Commission, the watchdog of fiscal rules for Eurozone countries, warned that France was drifting far from the EU's debt reduction targets. The numbers told the story. Germany's debt sat at just 62% of GDP. Spain hovered just above 100%. Even Italy, long seen as Europe's weakest economic link, carried 134%. But France? France had crossed a dangerous threshold, its debt exploding beyond 100% of GDP. The contrast was stark. A nation once seen as Europe's engine now looked more like its weakest link. For decades, France had one advantage: cheap money. Interest rates across Europe were low, and the French government could borrow almost without consequence. But that era ended in 2022. To fight inflation, the European Central Bank began raising rates. By late 2024 and early 2025, interest rates were at their highest in more than a decade. Suddenly, France's mountain of debt became far more expensive to maintain. It was a trap that developing countries know all too well. African nations have long been forced to pay punishing interest rates to global lenders. Now, France, a global power, was facing the same pressure. The numbers were staggering. France's interest payments alone had soared to 67 billion euros per year. Servicing the debt was like trying to breathe with a rope tightening around the neck. And the markets were watching. Bond investors began demanding higher yields just to hold French debt. Credit agencies issued stern warnings. If France failed to present a credible plan, its credit rating could be slashed. For a country that once dictated terms to others, France suddenly looked vulnerable, trapped by the very system it had long used to its advantage. To make matters worse, in 2024, the European Union reactivated its strict fiscal rules. These rules, which had been suspended during the pandemic, came back with full force. Suddenly, every member state was expected to bring deficits below 3% of GDP and public debt down to 60%. For France, already crushed under a mountain of debt, this was like tightening the noose. Meeting those targets would require sacrifices on a scale not seen in decades. That is why Prime Minister François Bayrou unveiled what he proudly called the perfect austerity measure. His plan promised a 45 billion euro budget squeeze, deep cuts to government spending, a leaner state, and the hope of regaining credibility in Brussels and on the financial markets. On paper, it was a neat solution. To technocrats and economists inside the European Commission, it looked like the rational choice. Numbers balanced, rules obeyed, targets met. But to the French people, it made no sense at all. They didn't see a policy adjustment. They saw an attack on the social model they had known all their lives, a system built on universal health care, public pensions, strong worker protections, and the promise of fairness. And when those foundations are threatened, history shows one thing: France pushes back. You see, France is not just any country. For decades, it has prided itself on having one of the most generous welfare systems in the world. Universal health care, public pensions, strong labor protections that shield workers from exploitation, long holidays that were fought for on the streets and written into law. To the average French citizen, these things are not luxuries, they are rights. They are part of what it means to be French, a social contract passed down through generations that promised fairness and dignity in exchange for hard work and loyalty to the nation. This is why François Bayrou's austerity plan was doomed from the start. It wasn't just about numbers or deficits. It was about identity. He wasn't tinkering with policy. He was striking at the very heart of the French social model. The anger wasn't just over pensions being cut or holidays being abolished. It went deeper than that. For millions, the question was simple. Why should ordinary people carry the burden while corporations and the wealthy remain shielded? Why should teachers, nurses, and retirees give up the rights they had built over decades, while billionaires and big business escape with little sacrifice? In the eyes of the public, Bayrou's plan wasn't a cure. It was betrayal, a policy that punished the many in order to protect the few, and once that belief took hold, there was no going back. The truth is, austerity has rarely saved the people, whether in wealthy nations or struggling economies. History proves it. In the early 2000s, several countries in southern Europe like Greece and Spain were forced into austerity under pressure from international creditors such as the IMF and the EU. But the results? Catastrophic. In Greece, entire communities were plunged into poverty. Families lost homes, jobs, and dignity. Suicide rates climbed. For many, the austerity years were darker than the financial crash itself. In Spain, unrest shook the country for years. The pain was so deep that it scarred an entire generation. This is why the French people rose up. They understood what austerity meant, and they refused to walk that path. They refused to see their pensions vanish, their holidays stripped, and their hard-earned rights turned into bargaining chips for Brussels. So they marched, demanding better, demanding a future where the burden wasn't dumped solely on their shoulders. And now, all eyes turn to France's new prime minister. The question looms large. Will he abandon austerity or double down in a bid to tame France's staggering debt? The next few months will decide more than just the fate of one government. They will determine whether France can navigate its greatest economic storm in decades, or whether the country itself becomes ungovernable. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, join the conversation, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories reshaping our world.